and 8:55 in the morning, 9 people in a glass-walled conference room on the 41st floor. 9 leather folders. 9 faces arranged into the specific gravity of people who have already decided how this ends, and the bankruptcy filing sat open on the table. 52 pages, a yellow tab marked the last page. Someone had already flagged the signature line, the pen touched paper, and then the door opened. She walked in without knocking, navy suit, badge raised, and 2 men behind her, still as concrete. The room didn't just go quiet, it stopped breathing. 9 heads turned. 9 pairs of eyes moved from the badge to the woman holding it, and then slowly to the man seated 2 chairs from the head of the table, and his hands were flat on the surface. His face showed nothing. That was the thing. He showed absolutely nothing. The CEO hadn't signed yet. The pen was still on the page. Someone in that room had been waiting years for this morning, and someone else had made sure it would never arrive the way it was planned. And 2:10 in the morning, 41st floor, the city below was doing what Chicago always did at this hour, breathing, slow and indifferent. Somewhere beyond the glass, Lake Michigan sat flat and black, vast and permanent, not caring about any of it, and Lorraine Mitchell sat with her eyes closed. Not even close to sleeping, her hands rested on top of a stack of papers. 52 pages, crisp edges, and the kind of document that takes months to prepare and seconds to destroy everything you built. The signature line was on page 52, yellow tab. Someone had already flagged it. Someone had already assumed she would get there, and she had not gotten there yet. The office around her was dark except for the monitor. She had dimmed the overhead lights herself 2 hours ago, after everyone else went home. The monitor cast a pale blue glow across the desk, across her hands, and across the bankruptcy filing she was not ready to sign. She was not ready because she was not finished watching. 22 years, that was the number she kept coming back to. Not the billion-dollar valuation, not the Fortune 500 contracts, and not the profile in Business Quarterly that called her the architect of the new security infrastructure, and 22 years since she dragged a second-hand server into the basement of a 3-flat in Bronzeville and started building something from nothing because nobody was going to build it for her. No investors, no family money, and no co-founder with the right connections, just her, and the conviction that the world needed smarter protection, and the stubbornness to prove it when nobody agreed. She had coded the first prototype herself, and sleeping on a folding cot between 18-hour sessions, eating whatever cost the least, calling companies that hung up on her, calling them again and again, until one didn't hang up, until one signed, until one became 5 and 5 became 50, and the company that started in a basement had a name on a building 41 floors above the street core shield. Her name was on the lease. Her fingerprints were on every system, every protocol, every proprietary algorithm, and every framework that made the company worth what it was worth. She had touched all of it. She had built all of it. And now it was bleeding out. 13 months. 4 major contracts gone, and each one walking out the door with the same polite language about competitive offers and budget realignment. Each one going to Vantage Systems, a firm half the size of Core Shield with a quarter of the track record. Vantage kept underbidding her, and not dramatically, not by numbers that made obvious sense, just enough. 3%, 7%, 5.5%. The kind of margin that wasn't a coincidence, and the kind of margin that meant someone had seen the inside of Core Shield's pricing models and was using them as a floor. She had hired 2 independent auditing firms. Neither found anything. She had questioned her sales team, her pricing analysts, and her technology leads. Nothing surfaced. Nothing pointed anywhere useful. And then the federal defense contract, 19 months of preparation, a technical submission so detailed, so specific, and so anchored in Core Shield's proprietary framework that Lorraine had considered it unassailable. Vantage had won it, with a technical framework that mirrored Core Shield's submission in structure, in methodology, and in specific language that did not exist anywhere in the public domain. That was not competition. That was theft. But theft required proof, and proof required someone making a mistake she could catch, so she had arranged one, and the monitor in front of her, the one she had left glowing while she sat in the dark with her eyes closed, was displaying Core Shield's internal access log dashboard, real time, every login, every file request, every download, every timestamp, and data that only she and the IT security team had clearance to view. She had pulled it up herself 3 hours ago and left it visible, and turned off the overhead lights and settled into her chair and waited. She was not setting a trap for the security system. She was testing something that couldn't be measured in data. Whether anyone in this building still had integrity. Whether the rot had gone all the way through, or whether something clean still existed somewhere in the 41 floors below her name. Irrational. She knew that. Desperate, certainly, but desperation sometimes sees what confidence walks past. The cleaning cart hit the door at 2:14, she heard it before she saw it. The quiet rattle of the cart against the frame, the soft drag of wheels across carpet. She kept her eyes closed, kept her breathing even, felt the shift in the room's air when the door opened wider and someone stepped inside. He moved carefully, not fast, not careless. The way someone moved when they actually noticed that the room had a person in it and adjusted accordingly. She heard the vacuum stay off, heard him set something down gently instead of dropping it. Then the footsteps stopped, and the room went very, very still. Donald Thomas had been working the night shift at Core Shield for 3 years and 4 months. He knew the 41st floor the way you know something you've cleaned 300 times. The location of every outlet, the way the carpet near the east windows had started to pill at the edges, the particular sound the HVAC made between 3 and 4 a.m. that the day staff never heard because they were never there, he knew the corner office at the end of the hall was never occupied after 7. The executive who used it was always gone by 6:30 at the latest, heels clicking toward the elevator, already on her phone, already somewhere else in her head before she reached the lobby. So when he saw the light under the door, he almost didn't go in. Almost. The job was the job. You cleaned what was on the list. You didn't skip floors because something felt unusual. He had learned that lesson 3 months in, when he'd skipped a conference room that turned out to have food left on the table. The building manager had noticed by morning. Donald couldn't afford a write-up, couldn't afford anything that put his employment in question. Brian needed the electricity to stay on. Brian needed the refrigerator to have food in it. Brian needed new shoes in August because he'd grown again, a full size, almost overnight the way teenagers did, and Donald had stared at the receipt for those shoes for a moment before putting it in his pocket. He pushed the cart inside. The woman in the chair looked asleep, genuinely asleep, head tilted slightly, hands resting on papers, breathing slow and even. He had seen Lorraine Mitchell maybe a dozen times in 3 years, always in motion, always surrounded, always carrying something enormous in her posture, not stress exactly, more like the permanent weight of being the person who had to have all the answers. He had never seen her still before. He left the vacuum off, started with the far corner, moved slow, the kind of clean that prioritized quiet over efficiency, which he'd learned to do on floors where people worked late. You adjusted, you read the room. That was the job nobody in the job description actually wrote down. He was reaching for the small trash bin near the credenza when his eyes caught the monitor, he didn't mean to look. That was the truest thing he could say about what happened next. He didn't mean to. The screen was angled toward the door, glowing blue-white in the dark office, and the format on it was so specific, so immediately familiar, that his brain processed it before he made any conscious decision to engage ACAS log. He had read access logs every day for 11 years at Data Core Solutions in Atlanta. Firewalls, network integrity, penetration testing, the entire vocabulary of system security lived in that format. Column headers, timestamp structure, account identifiers, file classification tags. He knew it the way you knew the layout of your own kitchen, without thinking, without trying, and what he saw on that screen made him stop moving entirely. He stood 6 feet from the monitor. That was close enough. The account name was in the second column. V. Bryant, COO. The activity log beneath it stretched down the screen, line after line, the timestamps all clustered in the same window. Between 1 light a.m. and 4 a.m. night after night. Over and over across a span of weeks. He couldn't calculate from where he stood, but that clearly went back months. The file classifications were visible in the 4th column. Prop Pricing Algo. Defense Contract Submit Final, Client Vuln Assessment, Strategic Bid Framework 187 entries. He counted 3 rows and multiplied. His chest did something, not a dramatic thing, a quiet thing. The sensation of recognizing a pattern you've seen before in a different context and understanding immediately what it means. He had seen this before. Smaller scale, different company, same shape, and someone was bleeding this place from the inside. He should leave, that was the rational thought. Clean and clear and loud, he was a janitor. This was not his flaw in any sense that mattered beyond the literal one. He had no clearance for this data, and he had no standing to interpret it. He had no protection if anyone decided later that his presence in front of this screen constituted something actionable, and he was 3 years and 4 months into a job that kept Brian in a warm apartment in Southside Chicago. 3 years and 4 months of clocking in at 10, clocking out at 6, keeping his head down, and rebuilding something quiet and stable after everything that wasn't quiet or stable had collapsed. The divorce had taken the house. He'd known it would. The job had gone 6 months later. Not fired, he had left, and walked out of the Datacorp building on a Tuesday afternoon, and driven to a parking lot, and sat there for 2 hours, and then called his brother and said he couldn't do it anymore. He hadn't meant the job. Jeffrey had known that. Jeffrey had said, very carefully, take whatever time you need, and then, less carefully, but with the same love underneath, you still have a son, Donald, and he had taken the janitorial position because it was available and because it asked nothing of him that he currently had left to give. No decisions, no systems to protect, no responsibility beyond the task directly in front of him, and the work was honest and it paid and it kept the lights on for Brian. That was what mattered, getting involved in whatever was on that screen in corporate data theft and boardroom betrayal and federal-level financial crimes, and which was clearly what the pattern indicated. That was the kind of decision that unraveled men like him. He knew this with certainty. He had already been unraveled once. He looked at the screen. He looked at Lorraine Mitchell, still in her chair, and still and unmoving. He thought about Brian asking him at dinner 3 nights ago whether Donald liked his job. Not in a probing way. Just curious. The 14-year-olds were curious about things they were starting to think about for themselves, and Donald had said it was fine. Brian had nodded and gone back to his food, and Donald had sat across from his son and felt the hollowness of a man who had once been excellent at something and was now fine at something else entirely, and his hand was already in his pocket. He pulled out his phone, opened the camera, held it steady and began photographing the access log, every row he could capture clearly, every timestamp, every file name attached to V. Bryant, COO, and his hands did not shake, his breathing stayed even. Not because he wasn't afraid, because fear and action weren't mutually exclusive. He understood that now in a way he hadn't before everything broke. He worked quickly, methodically, and the way you work when you used to be good at something and the muscle memory is still there underneath all the rust. 12 photographs. 13. He zoomed in on the file classification column, got the timestamp header, and got the account name isolated in frame. Then he put the phone back in his pocket, picked up the trash bin, and finished what he came in to do. He emptied the bin into his cart, wiped the credenza with the cloth he kept in his left front pocket, and did not touch the monitor, did not approach the desk, moved back toward the door the same way he had entered quietly, adjusted to the room, careful not to disturb anything. He was in the hallway with the cart before he exhaled properly, and inside the office Lorraine opened her eyes. The room was empty. The faint smell of the cleaning cloth still hung near the door. The monitor was still glowing. She sat up slowly and looked at the screen, still scrolling, still logging, and still showing everything she had left it showing. She had heard the camera, the small, almost inaudible click, twice in quick succession. The kind of sound that blended into ambient noise if you weren't listening for it. She had been listening, and not specifically for that sound, not for that exact action, but for something. Any signal that the person who entered hadn't simply cleaned and left. She had not expected photographs. She had not expected someone to recognize what was on that screen, and the access log was not general public readable. You needed years of systems work to look at that format and understand in seconds what it was showing, and the night shift janitor on the 41st floor had looked at her monitor for less than 2 minutes and understood exactly what he was seeing. That meant he had not always been a janitor. She leaned forward and began reading the log herself, and line by line. She had been avoiding this for weeks, the specific act of sitting with the data and following the trail all the way to its end. Because she had already suspected where it led, and she had not been ready to be right. She was ready now, and Bryant's go. The entry started 91 days ago, 214 total transfers by the time she reached the bottom of the log. every download occurring in that same window 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. and the files themselves a complete inventory of CoreShield's most sensitive intellectual property, pricing algorithms, the full defense contract submission, client vulnerability maps, internal competitive assessments, and she cross-referenced the download dates against the dates CoreShield had lost each major contract. They matched, every single one. Vantage had submitted their underbid within days of each bulk download from Victor's account, and the company had not been outcompeted, it had been handed over, piece by piece, file by file, by the man who had been sitting 2 chairs to her left in every board meeting for 16 years. Victor Bryant had been her first hire, 2009, and CoreShield was 18 months old, operating out of a converted office space in the South Loop with 7 employees and 3 clients. Victor had come from a mid-sized network security firm in Houston, competent, calm, and the kind of person who made a room feel more organized just by entering it. She had offered him the COO position because he thought in systems the same way she did, and because she had needed someone she could trust to handle the operational machinery while she focused on the technology. She had trusted him without question for 16 years. She sat back and looked at the ceiling, not crying, and that would come later, or maybe it wouldn't. She had found that some betrayals ran too deep for tears and just settled into the body like a change in temperature. She was running a different calculation right now, the one that mattered most immediately, and what happened next, and in what order, and whether the evidence was solid enough to stop a signing that was scheduled for 9 hours from now. And the thing about 16 years was that it created a texture of shared experience that became indistinguishable from trust. She had not made a deliberate decision to trust Victor Bryant with everything, and she had simply worked alongside him long enough that the trust became structural, load-bearing, built into the architecture of how the company operated, which meant she had not been blindsided by a betrayal from outside, and she had been hollowed out from the inside by someone she had integrated so completely into the organism of CoreShield that when he moved against her, it was functionally the same as the company moving against itself. She sat with that for a long time, and the access log kept scrolling, real time. Nothing new loading in it. Was nearly 4 a.m. and the building was empty. But the history was all there, every entry, every timestamp, and every file name that represented something she had built and someone else had taken. She thought about the signing scheduled for 9 o'clock, 7 board members, 2 independent directors, Victor in his usual seat, 2 to her left, and Richard Ames at the head of the table with his careful language and his hollow expressions of regret. 52 pages of legal language that would begin the process of dismantling CoreShield, structured dissolution, liquidation of non-core assets, and the slow, procedurally correct death of everything she had built. Victor would sit there with his practiced expression. She could already see it, the appropriate solemnity, the quiet grief of a man who had believed in the company and watched it fail, and she had watched him deploy those expressions in other contexts: client losses, employee departures, difficult quarters, and had always read them as genuine. She understood now that they were performances, and the question was whether 9 o'clock could be stopped. That depended on what the janitor with the photographs did next. She had no way to contact him. She did not know his name, and she knew his face. She had seen it briefly before committing fully to the pretense of sleep, and she knew what he had chosen to do, and which was more than she could say about most people in this building, who had been paid substantially more to make good decisions. She could not control what happened next, and that was the part that required something. She had never been particularly good at waiting for someone else to act, and trusting that they would. She looked at the bankruptcy filing, 52 pages. Yellow tab on page 52, and she pushed it to the far edge of the desk. Then she leaned back in her chair, and for the first time in months, something other than dread settled into her chest. Not hope exactly, not confidence, something quieter than both, and the sense that she was not, after all, completely alone in this building. At 5:15 in the morning, she finally went to the small couch in the corner of her office and lay down. She did not sleep, but she closed her eyes and let herself rest in the knowledge that something had shifted tonight. Though she could not yet see its shape, in 4 hours the board would arrive. In 4 hours, and Victor Bryant would walk through the front doors with coffee and his rehearsed expression of a man who had accepted the inevitable. In 4 hours, Everything in this building would be different from what it had been the day before. She didn't know how, and she didn't know what the janitor would do with those photographs, or how fast federal processes moved, or whether the evidence was sufficient for the action it needed to trigger, but she knew one thing with the clarity that came in the hours before dawn, when you were too tired to lie to yourself. She had spent 22 years building Core Shield on the belief that integrity was systemic, that you built it into protocols and permissions, access controls, the org chart, that you could structure your way to trustworthiness. She had been wrong about that. You couldn't structure your way to trustworthiness. You could only find it, already present, in the people who chose it when no structure required them to, when no one was watching, when the rational calculation was to look at the screen and walk away and let someone else carry the weight. The man who cleaned her office had chosen differently, and she didn't know his name. She didn't know what he had done before this job, or what it had cost him to become the person who did this one. She only knew what she had heard: the careful footsteps, the long pause, and the quiet clicks of a camera, and what those sounds added up to. Someone had seen the truth, and someone had not been able to leave it alone. Outside the windows, Chicago was beginning to gray at the edges. Not light yet, not quite, the quality of dark that existed for the 20 minutes before dawn actually arrived. The snow that had fallen 2 days ago still sat in ridges along the window ledges undisturbed, and Lorraine Mitchell lay on the couch and listened to the building breathe. By 6 a.m., the first day security shift would arrive. By 7:45, the executives would begin filtering in, and somewhere on the south side, a man who used to understand systems was driving home to his son. She had not earned what he'd done for her tonight. That was the part she would carry, the basement maintenance room smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. Donald sat on the metal bench with his phone in his hands and his cart parked against the wall, and the photographs open on his screen, he had looked at them 3 times since coming downstairs. They were clear, sharp enough to read every column header, every timestamp, every file classification, clear enough to matter if they got to the right person, the problem was he had no idea who the right person was. He also had a secondary problem, which was that a janitor photographing a CEO's security dashboard without authorization was not a neutral act. He was not naive about that, he had worked in corporate environments long enough to know how situations like this could be reframed, by lawyers who were paid to reframe them, by HR departments protecting company interests, by anyone who needed a scapegoat and found one conveniently holding photographs of sensitive data on a personal device. He could be the person who broke this case open, or he could be the person who was quietly terminated and legally maneuvered away from anything resembling credit or protection. Those 2 outcomes weren't mutually exclusive, he had seen enough of corporate machinery to know that individuals got processed by it in ways that had nothing to do with what they had actually done. He thought about Brian, not in an abstract way. Specifically, the way Brian looked at him over breakfast on the mornings Donald came home before the school bus arrived. That expression, not quite proud, not quite worried, something that lived between those 2 things that his son wore when he was watching Donald and trying to understand what kind of man his father was. Brian was 14. He was paying attention. Kids that age always were, even when they pretended otherwise. Donald opened his contacts, scrolled to a name he hadn't called in 4 years. Jeffrey Lewis, 56 years old, Cincinnati, Ohio, the older brother who had taken 3 years of silence from Donald without once making it about himself, and who had said on the one occasion Donald had called him from a parking lot unable to explain what was wrong, only, "You still have a son." It was 3:02 in the morning. Jeffrey picked up on the second ring, no sleepiness in his voice. The kind of man who, once he registered an incoming call at that hour from his younger brother, was awake before the phone reached his ear. "Talk to me." Donald talked, not all of it, not the backstory, not the 3 years of rebuilding himself from nothing. Just the facts, what he had seen on the screen, what the account name was, what the file classifications indicated, the timestamp pattern, the volume, he described it the way he used to write up incident reports at DataCore, precise, sequential, without editorializing. Jeffrey was quiet for a moment, then, "How clear are the photos?" "Clear enough to read every column." Another pause. Longer, Donald could hear his brother thinking, "Walk me through the timestamp structure, specifically." So Donald did. Jeffrey asked 11 questions over the next 40 minutes, not general questions, specific ones. What was the server prefix on the account identifier? Whether the file size column showed individual files or batch totals. Whether the download entries showed a destination address or only an origin log. Whether there was a session ID column, and whether the session showed interrupted or clean termination. Donald answered all of them from the photographs. Jeffrey was quiet for a long stretch after the last answer, long enough that Donald checked the call hadn't dropped. Then Jeffrey said, "I can tell you the pattern looks deliberate. The clustering, the classification levels, the volume increments, that's not accidental behavior, but I can't tell you it's airtight from photographs alone. I'm not in that world anymore. What you need is someone who still is." A pause. "I know someone at the FBI, she worked white-collar crimes out of the Chicago field office before she transferred to a federal task force. I worked alongside her 8 years ago on a corporate fraud case out of Ohio. Her name is Stephanie Harris." Another pause. "She's thorough, she's not going to take those photos and run with them blindly. She'll ask you hard questions about how you obtained them. But if the underlying data is real, she'll know exactly what to do with it. Can you reach her at 3 in the morning? I can give you her direct number and let you explain yourself, which is what you're going to have to do eventually anyway." Donald wrote the number down on the back of a supply inventory sheet because it was the only paper within reach, then he sat with it for a moment. "Jeffrey, yeah, if this goes wrong, don't. I'm just saying, I know what you're saying. You're saying if it falls apart, Brian needs someone." Jeffrey's voice was even, steady, the voice of a man who had already settled the answer before the question finished. "He has someone. Stop using that as a reason not to do the right thing." Donald was quiet. "You called me at 3 in the morning, Jeffrey said, you didn't call me to be talked out of it." The line stayed open for another few seconds. Then Donald said thank you and hung up. He held the phone for a moment. Then he dialed Stephanie Harris. She answered after 2 rings, her voice was alert in a way that didn't sound like someone who had just been woken. More like someone who slept light and accepted interruption as part of the job. Donald identified himself. Said Jeffrey Lewis had given him her number, said he had photographs of what appeared to be a systematic data exfiltration from a company's internal security logs, originating from a COO-level account spanning more than 2 months, targeting classified strategic documents. Stephanie Harris was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "What company?" Donald told her. Another pause. Different quality. Not the pause of someone processing new information. The pause of someone recognizing a name they already knew. "Are you an employee of Core Shield? Night shift maintenance. And how did you come to have access to this log data?" "I saw it on an open monitor. I photographed what I could read from 6 feet away." "Send me the photos." He sent them, she didn't say anything for almost 7 minutes. He sat in the maintenance room and waited and listened to the building settle around him, the sounds of a 41-floor structure at 4 in the morning. When she came back on the line, her voice had changed. Still professional, but underneath the professionalism was something else, controlled urgency, the voice of someone who had just watched 2 separate pieces of a puzzle click together. "Mr. Thomas, I need you to understand something before I say anything else. This information doesn't leave this conversation until I tell you it can. You don't discuss this with coworkers. You don't discuss it with anyone in that building. You go back to your shift, you finish your work, you clock out normally. I understand. I'm not going to tell you that you're protected. I'm not going to make you promises about how this plays out for you personally, what I will tell you is that what you've sent me is consistent with a pattern we have been building a file on for 6 weeks. A brief pause. We had pieces. We didn't have this, the photographs established direct account level attribution. That's the element we were missing. The warrant application has been in preparation for 2 weeks. What you've sent me may be the threshold we needed to move it forward." Another pause, shorter, "You did the right thing. The complicated thing, but the right one." She told him not to come in late the next morning. Then she ended the call. Donald sat alone in the maintenance room for a while after that, the supply inventory sheet with her number was still in his hand. He folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. He looked at the photographs one more time. Then he locked his phone, put it away, and got up to finish the rest of the floor. "That was the job. You finished what you started." He worked through the remainder of his shift the way he always did, methodically, quietly, room to room, he emptied bins and wiped surfaces and ran the vacuum at low settings on the floors where nobody was sleeping. He didn't let himself think too far ahead. He thought about the task in front of him. Then the next one, at 5:47 a.m., he rode the service elevator down to the basement, clocked out on the wall-mounted terminal, and walked to the parking lot where his car sat under a buzzing light in the far corner. He sat in the driver's seat for a minute before starting the engine. It was not yet 6. Brian wouldn't be awake for another hour and a half. The drive home was 20 minutes through streets that were still half asleep. He would get home before his son, he would put coffee on. He would be at the table when Brian came downstairs, the same way he was most mornings, the continuous low-grade act of being present that was the only parenting philosophy he had managed to hold on to through everything else that had dissolved. He started the car, the thing he kept coming back to, driving south through the pale early dark, was not whether he had made the right decision. That question had already been settled somewhere between looking at the screen and reaching for his phone. What he kept coming back to was something quieter, older, he had walked into that office tonight as a janitor, and somewhere between the door and the monitor, something else had walked in with him. Something he had deliberately set down in Atlanta 4 years ago, packed away like equipment he decided he no longer had the right to carry. He had spent 3 years telling himself that the man who understood those systems was gone, that the version of himself who could read a log format at a glance and know within seconds what it meant had dissolved along with the marriage and the house and the career. That Donald Thomas was a different person now. Simpler, defined by what he could safely carry without dropping, but you couldn't unknow what you knew. You could refuse to use it. You could avoid situations where it became relevant, you could clean floors instead of securing networks and tell yourself the distance was necessary, and that it was enough to be stable, to be present, to be the kind of father who was home in the morning, and then one night you walked through the wrong door and saw the wrong screen, and everything you had set down came back online without asking your permission. He pulled into the parking lot of his building. Sat for another moment, upstairs, his son was sleeping. By 9 o'clock this morning, things in a building 41 floors above Chicago were going to be very different from how they were right now. He didn't know exactly how, he didn't know what Stephanie Harris would do with those photographs, or how fast federal processes moved, or whether the evidence was sufficient for the action it needed to trigger, but he knew what he had seen, and he knew, in the way that certain things settle into certainty when everything else is uncertain, that he had not been able to walk away from it, not because he was brave. He would be honest about that. He was not particularly brave, but there were things a person couldn't unknow, and once you stopped pretending otherwise, you had to decide what to do with what you knew. He got out of the car, climbed the stairs, unlocked the apartment door quietly. The hallway was dark, Brian's bedroom door was closed, the small strip of carpet in front of it undisturbed. Donald put the kettle on, stood at the kitchen window while the water heated, watched the sky beginning to lighten over the roof lines to the east, the darkness pulling back in increments, the city reconsidering itself in the gray before dawn. He made coffee, strong, poured it into the mug Brian had given him 3 Christmases ago, the one with the thermal crack along the handle that Brian had tried to fix with superglue, and which now held together with the stubbornness of things that have been repaired by someone who wasn't ready to throw them away, he sat at the kitchen table and held the mug with both hands. He was not going to sleep. There was a particular kind of wired clarity that came after making a decision you hadn't planned to make, and sleep felt dishonest in the middle of it, like trying to leave before you'd seen how the thing ended. He did not know how it would end. That was the part he was sitting with. The part that couldn't be resolved by anything he did next. He had taken the photographs. He had called Jeffrey, he had called Stephanie Harris. He had done everything within his reach. Everything after that was outside his reach, in the hands of people with authority and resources and legal frameworks he couldn't access. He was a janitor who had photographed a security screen. He could be the person who helped break the case open, or he could be the person who was quietly let go and legally maneuvered away from anything resembling credit or protection. Those two outcomes weren't mutually exclusive. He had seen enough of how institutions processed individuals to know that what actually happened and what the paperwork said could be entirely different things, and Stephanie Harris had not promised him anything. He had noted that specifically. She had said he did the right thing, which was not the same as saying the right thing would protect him. Brian's alarm went off at 7:30. He heard it through the wall, and the muffled buzz of a phone, then quiet, then the sounds of a 14-year-old negotiating with consciousness. By 7:45, Brian was in the kitchen doorway in his school sweatshirt, and wearing the expression of someone who had not yet fully committed to being awake and was reserving judgment on the whole enterprise. "You're home early. Same time as always." Brian looked at the clock on the microwave, looked at Donald, and "You didn't sleep." "I'm fine. That's not what I asked." Donald almost smiled. Brian had started doing this in the past year, catching the non-answers, the deflections, the things Donald said that were technically accurate and emotionally incomplete, and it was an uncomfortable development in a son. Long night. Good coffee. "I'm fine." Brian poured himself cereal, sat across from his father, ate in the comfortable silence they had built over 4 years of mornings in this kitchen, and the two of them calibrated to each other's rhythms, the way people who share a small space either learned to do or didn't. Donald watched his son and thought about Stephanie Harris moving through a federal building somewhere across the city, and about what was happening on the 41st floor right now, and about whether the photographs had been enough. He would not know for a while. Maybe a long while. Brian rinsed his bowl, picked up his backpack, paused in the kitchen doorway. "Dad," and Donald looked up. "You good?" The question was simple. Brian asked it the way teenagers asked things when they wanted a real answer but were leaving you the exit if you needed it, and Donald recognized the architecture of it because he had built something similar when he was 14, and his own father came home from night shifts, looking like he'd been somewhere difficult. "I'm good." And then, and because Brian was watching him with the attention of someone who had learned not to take fine at face value. "I saw something tonight I probably wasn't supposed to see, and I had to decide what to do about it." Brian was quiet for a moment, processing. "And what'd you do?" "The harder thing." Brian looked at him, 14 years old, still a kid, already not entirely one. "Okay." He shifted the backpack on his shoulder. "See you tonight." The door closed, and Donald sat alone in the kitchen with his coffee, and the sound of the building starting its morning around him, and the knowledge of what he had set in motion 6 hours ago in a dark office 41 floors above this city. He didn't know what was coming, but he was still the man who had understood that screen. And whatever happened next, whatever the morning brought, whatever came after the morning, that was something nobody had actually taken from him. He had just set it down for a while, and Victor Bryant arrived at 7:47 a.m., not 7:45, not 7:50. 7:47, which was exactly when he always arrived on days when something significant was scheduled, early enough to signal readiness, late enough to avoid looking anxious. And Lorraine had noticed this pattern years ago and filed it away as a charming professional vanity. A man who managed his entrances. She understood now that everything Victor managed was an entrance, and he came through her office door with 2 cups of coffee from the place on the lobby level. The good coffee, not the building's drip machine. He had walked an extra 4 minutes to get the better version, and which on any other day would have read as consideration. He set 1 cup on the edge of her desk with the ease of a man who had done this hundreds of times, which he had, and lowered himself into the chair across from her with an expression she had seen him deploy at funerals. Appropriate grief, measured, not overdone. Long night. His voice was warm, textured with concern. She picked up the coffee, drank, and said nothing about the logs, said nothing about the photographs, said nothing about the call she had made at 6:15 a.m. and to CoreShield's outside legal counsel to ask a single question about the legal exposure of a board member who signed a bankruptcy filing while possessing evidence of internal fraud. The answer had been comprehensive. It had taken 11 minutes, and it had ended with the lawyer saying, "Do not sign anything this morning." She had said thank you and hung up. Victor was talking. She registered the words at surface level. Board meeting at 9, the asset liquidation timeline, and the communication strategy for employees. His voice moved through the room with the authority of someone who had presented bad news so many times that he had learned to make it sound like a plan rather than a failure. She watched his mouth move, and 16 years, the coffee was good. She drank it and watched him and thought about the email her legal counsel had forwarded at 6:47, with the subject line marked urgent, and a file attachment she had not yet opened because Victor had knocked on her door 30 seconds after it arrived. She would read it later. After whatever this morning became, the board is going to want the signing done before 10, and Victor was saying, Richard's flying to DC at noon. If we run long, we won't run long. Her voice came out even, neutral. The voice she used in negotiations when she wanted the other party to think nothing was happening behind her eyes. And 9 o'clock. We sign. Done, Victor nodded. He lifted his coffee, and for one fraction of a second, something moved behind his eyes that wasn't grief and wasn't concern and wasn't the expression of a man who had accepted an outcome. And it was satisfaction. She had not imagined it. She was certain of that. She looked down at the desk before he could see that she had seen it. And the board members arrived between 8:15 and 8:50. They came in the order they always came in. Richard Ames first, because he was constitutionally incapable of not being the first person in a room. Richard was 63, broad-shouldered, and with close-cropped grey hair, and the unhurried bearing of a man who had chaired enough crisis sessions that urgency no longer registered on his face. He was followed by the 2 independent directors, then the 4 investor representatives, and then the 2 most recently appointed members who were still performing the attentiveness of people who hadn't yet learned when not to speak. 9 people, 9 leather folders, and 9 bottled waters arranged by the administrative assistant who had come in early to set this room up, who had asked Lorraine last week if there was anything she needed, and to whom Lorraine had said no, everything's fine, and which had been the most thoroughly incorrect statement she had made in recent memory. The conference room was glass-walled. She could see them settling in as she walked down the hall from her office. Richard at the head of the table, uncapping a pen, and the independent directors leaning toward each other in the low murmur of people who had already spoken before the meeting began. Victor already seated, 2 chairs from the head, and the defense contract files arranged in front of him with the precision of a man who liked to look prepared. He was very good at looking prepared. She pushed through the glass door, and 9 sets of eyes came up. Good morning, and she pulled out her chair at the head of the table opposite Richard, set the bankruptcy filing in front of her. 52 pages, yellow tab visible at the edge, the small adhesive flag that someone had placed there to make the signing efficient and to remove any friction from the process of ending something she had built over 2 decades. She did not open the filing. Richard began with the formalities, and his voice had the cadence of a man who had presided over difficult meetings for 30 years, unhurried, grave, faintly ceremonial. He thanked everyone for their time. He acknowledged the difficulty of the situation. He expressed, and as he had expressed in the previous emergency session 3 days ago, his deep respect for what CoreShield represented, and his regret that circumstances had led them here. Circumstances. She had been letting that word sit unchallenged for 3 days, and as if the company's collapse had been weather, as if it had simply arrived without cause, without author, without the 16 years of access that had made it possible. She picked up her pen. Victor's posture shifted slightly. A small adjustment, and the kind a person made when they moved from waiting to expecting. Richard was still talking. The liquidation timeline, the employee notification process, the structured dissolution schedule. His words had weight and no content, and the gravity of language designed to make an irreversible action feel managed and inevitable. Lorraine looked at the signature line on page 52. She had not slept, and the coffee Victor brought was still doing partial work, but the exhaustion underneath it was the kind that couldn't be corrected by caffeine, only by resolution, by the morning ending differently than it was supposed to, and she lowered the pen toward the page. The tip touched paper, and the conference room door opened, and Stephanie Harris moved like someone who had learned that hesitation cost more than it saved. She was through the door before Richard Ames fully registered that someone had entered without knocking, and which was a thing that did not happen in Richard Ames's experience of board meetings, and his expression moved through surprise to indignation, to something more complicated as he took in the navy suit and the badge, and the 2 agents positioned at either side of the door with the stillness of people who were prepared to wait as long as necessary, and Stephanie held up the badge long enough for the room to understand what it was. My name is Special Agent Stephanie Harris, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Chicago Field Office. Her voice was level, not loud, the kind of voice that didn't need volume because it already had everything else. We're here to execute a federal search warrant on the digital accounts, devices, and office of Victor Bryant, Chief Operating Officer of Core Shield Technologies, in connection with an ongoing investigation into theft of trade secrets and corporate espionage under Title 18, United States Code. The room went silent, not the polite silence of a meeting pausing for a new speaker. The other kind, the kind that happened when something entered a space and changed everything about it. 9 people who had come to this room to perform a procedural ending sat in their chairs and didn't move. Victor did not move either. His hands were flat on the table, his face had gone through 3 expressions in the time it took Stephanie to finish her sentence, and Lorraine had watched all 3. The first was surprise genuine, or close enough that she couldn't separate them. The second was calculation, the third was the face he landed on, the one he chose to wear, measured composure, the expression of a man who had prepared for this possibility and decided how he would carry it. He turned to Lorraine. What is this? Not accusation, not panic, a careful question calibrated for witnesses. She met his eyes. Said nothing. Richard Ames was on his feet. He had 30 years of boardroom authority and he deployed all of it toward the door. On what basis do you have the authority to interrupt a private legal proceeding? This is a closed board session. Stephanie handed him a copy of the warrant without changing her trajectory. She was already looking at Victor. Mr. Bryant, I need you to step out of the conference room. Nobody moved. The moment had the quality of a frame held too long. 9 board members, 2 federal agents, Lorraine with her pen still resting on page 52 of a document she had not signed, Victor Bryant with his hands flat on the table and his face arranged into wronged dignity. Then one of the independent directors shifted in her chair. The sound of its small, leather, utterly unremarkable broke something loose in the room, Richard read the warrant. His eyes moved down the page with the speed of a man reading for comprehension rather than performance, and whatever he found there changed the set of his jaw. He sat back down without speaking, Victor looked at Lorraine one more time, and then he stood. He buttoned his jacket. One button, the deliberate gesture of a man maintaining control over the only thing still available to him. He looked at the warrant in Richard's hands, then he looked at the glass walls of the conference room, at the open office beyond, at the company that had his fingerprints on everything except the files he had stolen from it. Then he looked at Lorraine. I didn't do this because I hated you, His voice was quiet, steady. The room was so still that every person in it heard every word. I did it because 16 years of building something with you never once included you asking me what I wanted from it. She held his eyes. He held hers, then he walked to the door. The 2 agents fell in beside him without touching him. The glass door opened and closed, and the 3 of them moved down the corridor toward the elevators, and then they were gone. The conference room stayed frozen, the bankruptcy filing sat open on the table. Page 52, yellow tab. Lorraine's pen beside it, uncapped, horizontal where she had set it down when the door opened. She did not pick it up. Richard broke the silence first, his voice had lost its ceremony. What was underneath it was something more human and less rehearsed. Did you know this was going to happen? I knew something was wrong. She looked at the empty chair 2 seats to her left, I didn't know they were going to walk through that door this morning. Both of those things were true. The board looked at each other, then at her. Then at the unsigned document on the table. Richard Ames, who had been certain of this morning's outcome since Wednesday, asked the question none of them had expected to be relevant. What do we do now? Lorraine looked at the filing, at the yellow tab on page 52, at the signature line below it, which remained blank. We wait, she said. And we see what the evidence looks like when it's been through proper review. Nobody argued. 4 hours away in time, though only blocks away in distance, the federal building on West Madison was already moving at a different speed than the paralyzed conference room on the 41st floor. Stephanie Harris sat across from her supervisor in a 14th floor conference room, with Donald Thomas's photographs printed on the table between them, alongside the digital forensic preliminary pulled from the warrant service conducted simultaneously with the board meeting appearance. Her team had moved fast, faster than usual, because 6 weeks of a stalled investigation had just received the direct evidentiary support that changed the math on everything. The preliminary forensic analysis was 23 pages. The first 7 confirmed what Donald had photographed. Account-level attribution for 214 file transfers over 91 days, all originating from Victor Bryant's credentials, all targeting documents classified as proprietary strategic intelligence. The technical pattern was consistent with deliberate data exfiltration, not accidental access, not system error, not authorized bulk download. Someone had known exactly which files to take and had taken them in increments sized, specifically to avoid triggering Core Shield's automated anomaly detection threshold. Pages 8 through 14 were where the investigation widened. The forensic team had traced the endpoint destinations of 7 of the file transfers before the warrant was served. Each one terminated at a secure external server registered to a shell company called Meridian Consulting Group, LLC, incorporated in Nevada 14 months ago. The registered agent was a law firm in Reno that specialized in corporate privacy structures, a legal and unremarkable arrangement, the kind used by thousands of legitimate businesses. What was not unremarkable was who had signed the LLC's operating agreement as managing member: Scott Hill, Vice President, Strategic Development, Vantage Systems, Chicago. Stephanie had known Vantage was involved, that had been the working theory for 6 weeks. But knowing and proving operated in different jurisdictions, and what the forensic team had found in the overnight hours was the bridge between them. Victor Bryant had been sending Core Shield's most sensitive strategic data to a shell company controlled by Vantage's third-ranking executive, and Scott Hill had been using that data to construct Vantage's competitive bids with a precision that no amount of legitimate market intelligence could have produced. The total value of contracts Vantage had won using Core Shield's stolen frameworks was somewhere north of $340 million. The financial arrangement between Victor and Scott Hill was still being traced, but the preliminary suggested payments routed through Meridian back to a separate account registered to a second LLC, this one in Delaware. This one with Victor Bryant as managing member, totaling just over $2.7 million across 11 months. Stephanie's supervisor looked at the preliminary for a long time without speaking. Then, "How solid is this?" "Solid enough to hold up. We'll need the full forensic to confirm the financials, but the file transfer data is airtight, digital chain of custody is clean, and the source? The photographs." Stephanie thought about Donald Thomas sitting in a maintenance break room at 4 in the morning with photographs on his phone and his brother's number already dialed. Credible, took real personal risk to report it. No apparent motive to fabricate. His background checks out: 11 years as a network systems engineer before a career gap. She paused. He's also the reason we could move this week instead of waiting another month to build the evidentiary chain independently. He's got exposure on the unauthorized observation, I know. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Another pause, but what he provided was the threshold that moved a 2-week-old warrant application from pending to executable. That matters. Her supervisor nodded slowly, looked at the photographs again. Every column header, every classification tag, every timestamp readable in the printouts. What are we doing about Vantage? Parallel warrant. Scott Hill's office and accounts. We serve it today. Core Shield's defense contract, referred to the contracting agency for review and suspension pending outcome. I made that call at 6 this morning. Her supervisor set the preliminary down. Okay, move it. Stephanie was already standing. Back on the 41st floor, the conference room had begun to empty. Board members gathered their folders and their bottled waters and their carefully managed expressions and filed out in ones and twos, some stopping to speak quietly to Lorraine, some simply nodding and leaving. Richard Ames stayed. He was the kind of man who needed to understand events before he could walk away from them. Lorraine told him what she could: the access logs, the pattern she had discovered during the night, the decision not to sign. She did not tell him about Donald, not yet, that was a story she needed to understand more fully before she handed it to anyone who would immediately begin contextualizing it in terms of legal liability or corporate narrative. Richard had asked, carefully, whether she had set this up, she had thought about how to answer that. I created the conditions for someone honest to act, she said finally. I didn't know who that would be. Richard looked at her for a long moment, and then he closed his leather folder and left without saying anything else, which from Richard Ames was the equivalent of complete trust. Now she was alone, and the bankruptcy filing sat on the corner of her desk where she had left it when she came back from the conference room. Still open to page 52. Yellow tab still in place. She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed it. Not filed away, and not destroyed, just closed. A document that described a possible future that had not arrived yet and might not. Her email was catastrophic. She ignored most of it and opened the one from her outside legal counsel, the one that had arrived at 6:47 that morning while Victor was in her office with his coffee and his rehearsed expression. The email was 2 paragraphs. The first outlined the legal exposure of signing a bankruptcy filing while in possession of evidence of internal fraud, and the second was a single sentence. If the evidence is what you believe it to be, do not sign anything today. She had not signed anything. She pulled up the security camera archive for the 41st floor. The timestamp she wanted was between 2:10 and 2:30 a.m. The file loaded slowly, then the image appeared, 41st floor, East Corridor, camera 3. Her office door still half open, the lights still on inside. She watched the footage, and a man with a cleaning cart pushed through the door at 2:14. Medium height, moving carefully with the practiced economy of someone whose work required not disturbing occupied spaces, and she watched him begin the routine efficiency of someone who had done this specific job enough times that the movements were automatic. She watched him stop, watched him turn toward the monitor, 2 minutes and 11 seconds, and that was how long he stood there. She watched him reach for his phone, watched him photograph the screen, watched him put the phone away, complete what he had come in to do, and leave without increasing his pace, without looking back, and without any of the behavioral signals she would have expected from someone in a state of high agitation. He had been calm, not the calm of someone indifferent to what they'd seen. The calm of someone who had looked at a situation and recognized it fully, made a decision, and then carried the decision out the same way he carried out any task, steadily, thoroughly, without leaving things half done. She watched the footage 2 more times, and then she opened the building's employee records and searched the night shift maintenance roster. His name was Donald Thomas. She said it quietly, to herself, in the empty office. Then she wrote it down, and at 2:33 that afternoon, her phone rang. Stephanie Harris, the forensic analysis is holding up. Victor Bryant's account is confirmed as the origin point for all 214 transfers. We've established the connection to Scott Hill at Vantage, and we're serving the parallel warrant on Vantage offices as we speak. Lorraine sat very still. The defense contract has been flagged for suspension pending review by the contracting agency. That came through at noon, and what does that mean for Core Shield's position on recompetition? It means nothing is final yet. It means the agency is aware that the winning bid may have been constructed on stolen intelligence. The contract is in formal review. A brief pause, and what happens next depends on the review timeline. I can't tell you how long that takes, but Vantage doesn't have it. Vantage doesn't have it. Lorraine looked at the window. The lake was visible on clear days from this angle, and today it was visible flat, gray-green, indifferent to everything happening 41 floors above it. What do you need from me? Corporate cooperation on the forensic access, your IT security team working directly with our analysts, and complete documentation of the contracts Core Shield lost, and the precise timeline relative to the download dates. You'll have it by end of business. A pause. Ms. Mitchell. The individual who brought this to our attention, Donald Thomas, and Lorraine waited. He took real personal and professional risk to report what he saw, and I want you to understand that the investigation would have continued. Without his photographs, we had 6 weeks of groundwork and a warrant application already in motion, but we would have needed considerably more time to reach the evidentiary threshold we reached this morning. His decision materially changed the trajectory and the timing of this case. She thought about 2 minutes and 11 seconds of footage, and a man standing in front of a monitor in the dark, not moving, just looking, and then deciding. I know, she said. I watched the camera footage. He should know what his decision accomplished. He will. The call ended. She sat at her desk. Outside, and Chicago was doing what it always did in the late afternoon, moving forward, entirely indifferent to what had happened in the 41st floor corner office 12 hours earlier. The traffic on the street below had the texture of an ordinary Tuesday, and people who did not know that anything had changed. People living in a world that had shifted that morning in ways none of them had witnessed. Victor Bryant was in a federal interview room on West Madison. Scott Hill at Vantage was, at this moment, watching agents work through his office. The bankruptcy filing was closed on the corner of her desk, and somewhere on the south side, a man who used to be a systems engineer was either sleeping or sitting in a kitchen with a coffee mug that had a cracked handle, not yet knowing how the morning he had helped create had ended. She did not know yet what she owed him, whether owed was even the right frame. What she knew was that he had walked into her office at 2:14 in the morning, with no reason to look at her screen and every rational reason to look away from it, and he had not looked away. That was not a debt, it was something harder to name and more necessary to acknowledge. She would find him. Not today. Today there was too much legal counsel, board communication, employee notification, the forensic cooperation she had promised Stephanie by 5 o'clock, today was the machinery of consequence doing what it was built to do, and her job was to keep pace with it. But she would find him, and she would tell him that what he had done in the dark, when no protocol required it, and no authority witnessed it, and every practical calculation said step away, it had mattered in ways she would be able to name with precision. That was the only honest place to start. At 9:42 that morning, before the afternoon call from Stephanie, Victor Bryant had been in a federal interview room on West Madison. He had not requested his attorney immediately, which had surprised Stephanie. In her experience, people in Victor's position, senior executives, financially sophisticated, legally aware, said the word lawyer within 30 seconds of sitting down. Victor had accepted water, looked at the table for a long moment, and then looked at her. "How did you find it?" She didn't answer. He nodded slowly, as though the non-answer confirmed something he had been working out on the walk over. "The logs, not a question. Someone saw the logs." She still didn't answer. Victor looked at the wall to his left, something moved through his expression that she couldn't categorize cleanly. Not regret. Closer to recognition. The expression of a man arriving at a conclusion he had intellectually considered possible and emotionally never quite prepared for. "I want my attorney," he said, quietly. Without drama, she nodded and stood. At the door she paused, not because she had anything to add to the legal proceedings, because there was a question that had been sitting in the back of her mind since she had read the warrant application that morning. The one built in significant part on photographs taken by a man who mopped floors for a living. She didn't ask it, it wasn't relevant to the case. But she thought about it on the walk back down the hall. About what it meant that the piece she had been missing for 6 weeks had come from someone no one in that building had ever thought to look at, about the gap between the people who were paid to notice things and the one person who had noticed because he still knew how, even after 4 years of deliberately trying not to. She thought about it, and then she went back to work. 4 months is a long time to not know if you still have a company. Lorraine learned this in increments, in the particular quality of Monday mornings when she walked into Core Shield's lobby and the security desk staff looked at her with expressions caught between loyalty and uncertainty. In the quarterly projections, her CFO presented with language carefully drained of confidence. In the client calls where she answered questions she couldn't fully answer and asked for patience she wasn't sure she had earned. The board had not pulled the bankruptcy filing. They had suspended it, pending investigation outcome, which sounded like a reprieve and functioned like a sentence with no stated end date. 4 months of suspended, 4 months of running a company that existed in a legal parentheses, neither dead nor definitively alive. While federal investigators worked through the forensic chain at the speed, federal investigators worked thorough, methodical, and entirely indifferent to the operational reality of a business trying to function underneath it. She had managed. That was the honest word for it. Not thrived, not recovered, managed, she had kept the remaining contracts active through personal relationship calls she should not have needed to make at her level. She had restructured the executive team with an interim COO from outside, a woman named Carol Lee, 51, brought in from a security firm in Dallas who was competent and careful and had the distinct advantage of not having stolen anything from anyone. She had communicated with employees in 3 separate all-hands sessions, and each one calibrated to give enough truth to sustain trust without giving so much uncertainty that people started updating their resumes on company time. Some of them updated their resumes anyway. That was the math of instability, and you couldn't control it. You could only minimize it and keep going. 2 enterprise clients had made quiet inquiries in week 6 of the investigation. Not offers, inquiries, and the kind of conversation that happened when a client who had left wanted to come back but needed to not look like they were coming back too eagerly. She had handled those calls herself, kept her voice neutral, and did not let them feel the weight of what their departure had cost during the months Core Shield was bleeding. The 3rd client had not called. She stopped expecting that call around week 10. The federal defense contract remained suspended, and the contracting agency had sent a formal letter in week 3 acknowledging the investigation and suspending Vantage's award pending review. The letter said nothing about Core Shield's position on recompetition, and it said review timeline to be determined, which was the government's way of saying, do not build your plans around this. She was not planning around it, but she was not letting it go either. The investigation moved, and Stephanie Harris provided updates at 2-week intervals, not comprehensive briefings, but enough. The forensic financial analysis confirmed the $2.7 million in payments from Scott Hill's shell company to Victor's Delaware LLC, and Victor had retained counsel and was in negotiation. Scott Hill was cooperating with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge framework. Vantage had lost its federal contracting eligibility pending the outcome of proceedings, and which was a corporate death sentence wrapped in bureaucratic language. Victor Bryant's trial date was set for 7 months out. Lorraine looked at that date on her calendar and moved to the next thing, and she could not afford to organize her sense of the future around a trial. The trial was the government's problem. Her problem was the company, every day, every decision. The grinding and unglamorous work of keeping something alive when the conditions it needed to thrive had not yet been restored. This was not the version of the story that made good press, and the version that made good press was the CEO who caught the traitor and saved the company. Clean, resolved, photogenic in its justice, and that version existed in the coverage that ran in the 2 weeks after the FBI warrant service, the headlines about corporate espionage and federal investigations, and a billion-dollar cybersecurity firm that had been hollowed out from the inside, and the actual version was slower and considerably less cinematic. It involved a lot of Tuesday afternoons in her office reviewing numbers that were improving but not improved, making calls to people who were supportive but cautious, and going home at 9 o'clock to an apartment where nobody was waiting to ask how it went. She was fine with that. The apartment, the solitude, and she had chosen her life with her eyes open and did not require it to look like someone else's idea of what a life should contain, but there were evenings in those 4 months when the silence in her apartment felt less like chosen solitude and more like the aftermath of something that had been narrowly averted, a specific kind of quiet that came from knowing how close the edge had been, and those were the evenings she stayed at the office until 10, and she found Donald on a Tuesday afternoon in week 6 of the investigation, not because she hadn't known where he was, and she had known since the morning after the warrant service had written his name on a notepad and left it on her desk where she could see it every day. But she had needed the first weeks to be about the investigation, the board, the client, and the communication strategy. She needed the situation to have some shape before she approached a man who had no reason to trust corporate intentions and every reason to be wary of what a CEO's gratitude meant in practice, and 6 weeks felt like the right distance, enough time for the immediate chaos to settle. Not so much time that silence became its own statement. She went down to the basement on a Tuesday at 4:30 p.m. and the maintenance room smelled the way it always smelled, industrial cleaner and metal and the flatness of air in rooms without windows. Donald was at the supply shelving unit along the back wall, organizing bottles in a sequence that was clearly systematic, and though she couldn't immediately identify the logic of it. He turned when he heard her. She had watched him on camera footage so many times in the past 6 weeks that she had constructed a detailed picture, but footage was incomplete in the ways. Footage always was. It gave her his movements without his stillness. He was very still now. the stillness of a person who had learned to wait for situations to clarify before responding to them. He looked at her, and at her blazer, at the fact that she had come down herself rather than sending someone. Ms. Mitchell, Lorraine is fine. She had not planned to say that first, but it came out, and because standing in the maintenance room in her blazer while he stood by the shelving unit felt like precisely the wrong register for the conversation she needed to have. I know who you are. I know what you did, and I needed to tell you in person that I understand what it cost you to do it. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was thinking, not discomfort. Stephanie Harris called me. His voice was even. 3 days after, and she told me the investigation was moving, that the photographs were part of it. They were more than part of it. They were the piece she needed to move a warrant application that had been sitting for 2 weeks. He looked at the shelf, and not away from her exactly. Sideways at something neutral, the way people looked when they were processing something they didn't quite have language for yet. I've been doing this job for 3 years and 4 months, he said, and nobody from the 41st floor has ever come down here. I know. I'm not saying that as a complaint. I know that too. He looked back at her, waiting. She had prepared for this conversation, and not scripted. She had learned enough about herself to know that scripted didn't work in moments that required something real. But she had thought about what she wanted to say and, more carefully, what she wanted to avoid saying, and the things that would sound like a CEO managing a situation rather than a person acknowledging another person. My son asked me something, he said, before she could find the start of what she had prepared. He asked me why I did it. He's 14, and he wanted to know why someone would risk their job for a company they don't own and a person they've never spoken to. She waited. I told him I saw something wrong and I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen it. He asked if that was the whole reason. A pause, and I told him no. I told him I used to understand those systems. I used to be good at it. And when I saw that screen, something in me recognized it before I had time to decide whether to recognize it or not. You can't unknow what you know, and you can ignore it. You can walk away from it, but you can't put it back in the box and close the lid and pretend it was never there. The room was quiet. Lorraine thought about the camera footage. 2 minutes and 11 seconds, and a man standing in front of a screen in the dark, not moving, just looking, and then deciding, why did you leave the industry? She had not planned to ask that, but it was the question underneath everything else. He considered it without defensiveness, and with the honesty of someone who had thought about this enough that the answer was accessible even if it wasn't simple. My marriage ended. And when it ended, everything I had been holding together around it came apart too, and the job was one of the things I was holding. I thought if I put it down I could pick up everything else. But you can't actually do that. You just end up with your hands empty and nothing to show for the trade. She didn't say she was sorry, and it would have been true and also not the point. I pulled your record at Datacore before I came down here, she said. Your work on the network integrity protocols in 2017. The penetration testing framework you built in 2019. She held his gaze steadily, and you didn't leave because you weren't good enough. You left because you were in pain. Those are different things. Something shifted in his expression. Not the kind of shift that led to declarations, and the quieter kind, the kind that happened when someone named a thing accurately that you had been carrying without a name for a long time. I'm creating a new internal division, Lorraine said, and I've been building the framework for it over the past 6 weeks. Its purpose is to monitor internal data access, flag anomalies in real time, and make certain that what Victor Bryant did, the sustained pattern of it, the precision of it, and the fact that it ran undetected for 3 months cannot happen again. Not because we were lucky enough to catch it. Because we built a system that catches it. He was listening with the full attention of someone who did not perform listening, and I need someone to lead it. Not a consultant from outside with no understanding of this company's particular vulnerabilities. Someone who has been inside these walls. Someone who knows what this building looks like at 2 in the morning, and someone whose judgment I have evidence of, specific, documented, high-stakes evidence. She paused. I'm asking you to take the position. He looked at her for a long time, not with surprise exactly, and more like he had entertained the possibility as a theoretical, and was now adjusting to it as a real offer, with real weight and real consequences in both directions. Are you asking me because you feel like you owe me something? And She had expected this question. Her answer was ready, and it was the truth, which made it easier to deliver cleanly. No, I'm asking you because you were the only person in this building who saw the truth and acted on it. 41 floors of people and executives who were paid specifically to understand this company's vulnerabilities. A board of directors with fiduciary responsibility. An IT security team whose literal function is to catch exactly what Victor was doing. Her voice stayed level. And you were the one. Not because you got lucky. Because you still had the knowledge and you used it when every practical argument said to keep walking. He was quiet. I'm also asking you, she said, and because I need someone in that role who will tell me when I'm wrong. Victor Bryant sent me an email 3 years ago proposing a comprehensive upgrade to our internal access monitoring system. I turned it down because of budget concerns, and if I had approved it, we would have caught his downloads within 2 weeks of when they started. She held his gaze. I need someone who isn't afraid to say, Lorraine, this is a mistake, and someone whose judgment I cannot dismiss because they have already proven it under conditions where proving it cost something real. The maintenance room was very quiet. Then Donald said, are you sure you want someone who's going to look at everything you do? And she said, without hesitating, that is exactly why I need you. He took 2 days. She had not expected him to accept immediately and had not wanted him to, and a decision made without consideration was a decision made without commitment, and she had learned enough about this man from 6 weeks of camera footage and employment records and Stephanie Harris's careful account of a 4 a.m. and phone call to know that he was not someone who made commitments carelessly. He called her on a Thursday morning. Said yes. She said good. Asked him to start the following Monday. He said he would finish out the week on the night shift first, and she had not anticipated that. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. The people on that crew do this job without shortcuts every night. I'm not going to disappear in the middle of a week without finishing my assignments. And she thought about that moment many times afterward. The integrity of a man who, having just accepted a significant professional reinstatement, chose to honor the small obligations of the position he was leaving. Not for show. The basement was empty, and nobody was watching him make that choice. He made it because it was the right thing to do, which was the only reason he ever seemed to do anything. She had hired the right person, and the trial of Victor Bryant began on a Thursday in February. Lorraine did not attend the opening day. Her attorney had explained that her presence would be noted, analyzed, and potentially used by Victor's defense to suggest personal animus rather than corporate harm. She stayed at the office. Read the coverage in the afternoon. Victor had pleaded not guilty on all 14 counts, and 12 counts of trade secret theft under the Economic Espionage Act, 2 counts of wire fraud, and his attorney's opening argument focused on the complexity of the digital evidence and the chain of custody of the photographs that had initiated the investigation. Photographs taken by an unauthorized observer on a personal device. The attorney said, and with careful emphasis on each word, she had expected this. Stephanie Harris had warned her weeks earlier. The defense would attack the source before attacking the substance, and standard practice in cases where the evidentiary chain began outside normal channels. What the defense attorney could not attack was the forensic evidence developed entirely independently of Donald's photographs, and the 214 file transfers traced through Core Shield's own server logs, the payments through the Nevada LLC, the encrypted communications between Victor and Scott Hill recovered from both their devices, Scott Hill's cooperation agreement, and which had produced documentation confirming the arrangement in Victor's own words, in his own hand, in emails he had apparently never expected anyone to read. The photographs had opened the door, and the investigation had built something that stood on its own foundation. She read the coverage and went back to work. The hearing that changed something fundamental in her understanding of Victor came 3 weeks into the trial, and his defense had entered into evidence a series of internal emails from 3 years earlier. Her own legal team had handed her copies the night before with a note that said simply, "You should see these before they appear in open court," and she read them at her kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night. The emails were a thread Victor to her. 3 years ago, May. Subject line: Internal Access Monitoring Proposal Urgent Review Requested. 8 emails over 12 days, and Victor's first email had been detailed and thorough. A comprehensive proposal for upgrading Core Shield's internal access monitoring infrastructure, new logging protocols, anomaly detection threshold, and automated alerts for bulk downloads exceeding a specified file size within a defined time window. The proposal estimated implementation cost at $3,400 and projected risk mitigation value across the subsequent 2 years with specific numbers attached. Her response had been 3 sentences. She thanked him for the thoroughness of the proposal, and she noted that current quarter budget allocations did not allow for the expenditure. She asked him to resubmit at the next annual budget review. He had resubmitted at the next annual budget review. She had approved a scaled-down version for $90,000 that covered 1/3 of the original proposal's scope, and the scaled-down version had not included the anomaly detection threshold feature, the specific feature that would have triggered an automated alert when a single account initiated bulk downloads above a certain volume within a defined window, and the feature that would have caught what Victor was doing within the first 2 weeks he started doing it. She sat at her kitchen table with those emails and did not move for a long time, and this was the thing she had not been able to see clearly until she saw it laid out in a courtroom document, and not that Victor had been right and she had been wrong. The proposal's merit did not retroactively justify what he chose to do in the years that followed, but she had built a system with a gap in it, and had been told about the gap precisely and in writing, had partially addressed the gap, and had decided, for budget reasons, not to close it completely. Victor had known exactly where the gap was, because he had been the one to identify it, and she did not sleep that night. In the morning she called Carol Lee and asked her to fast-track the implementation of the remaining 2/3 of the original 2021 proposal. Carol said she would have a timeline by end of week, and then she called Donald Thomas's extension and asked if he had time that afternoon. He said yes. She told him about the emails, not because she was required to, not because it was legally relevant to anything currently in motion, but because Donald Thomas was now leading the division whose entire purpose was to ensure this kind of gap was identified before someone could exploit it, and he needed to understand the full history, including the parts that reflected badly on the person who had hired him. He read through the email thread she slid across the table. Read it carefully, the way he read everything without rushing and without performing comprehension, just actually taking it in. Then he looked up. "You're telling me this because you want me to know it happened. I'm telling you this because you need to understand how these gaps get created, and they don't usually come from negligence. They come from reasonable people making budget decisions without full visibility into what the risk actually costs. My job is to weigh cost against priority. Your job now, is to make sure I understand what the cost of not investing actually is in specific terms, with specific numbers before I make the call." She held his gaze, and that means you have to be able to bring me something like this proposal and make the case for it, even when my first instinct is to find the cheaper version. He was quiet for a moment, and if you say no, then you make the case again, with different framing or new data or whatever the situation requires. You don't accept the cheaper version if the cheaper version leaves the gap open. What if you override me anyway? She looked at him steadily, then I'm accountable for what happens after. The same way I'm accountable for what happened here. He nodded slowly, not the nod of agreement, the nod of someone filing something in the correct place. "Okay," he said, and they got to work, the conversation with Brian happened on a Friday evening in April, 6 months after the warrant service. 5 months since Donald had moved from the night shift to a desk on the 32nd floor, the transition had not been seamless. He was honest about that with himself. The first weeks involved an exhaustion that came from re-inhabiting a professional identity he had walked away from, meetings with language he had to relearn, not because he had forgotten it, but because he had avoided it for so long that using it again felt like wearing clothes from a previous version of himself, clothes that still fit but needed time to feel like his again. It got easier. Gradually. The way things that were right for you got easier when you stopped working against them. Brian was at the kitchen table doing homework, physics, the textbook was open to a chapter on systems, closed systems, open systems, the movement of energy between states. Donald made dinner, the particular domestic rhythm of a Friday evening that had become reliable over the months, Brian talked about school between equations. Donald listened and added rice to the pot. At some point, without looking up from the textbook, Brian said, "Dad, yeah, do you think about that night still? The night at the office?" Donald stirred the pot and thought about the question honestly before answering it. "Sometimes. Do you regret it?" He had been waiting for this question since October and had known it would come because Brian was the kind of person who returned to things until he understood them completely. He set the spoon down, turned around and leaned against the counter and there are nights when I think about what would have happened if I'd just emptied the trash bin and left. Gone back to my root. Nobody would have known I was ever in that office, and the investigation might have found it eventually anyway. Stephanie Harris already had a file open and a warrant in preparation. Maybe it still would have gotten there. Brian looked up from the textbook and I think about what that version of me would have to live with. Not the consequences, the knowing. Every morning after that, getting up and going to a job, and knowing that I saw something I understood and chose not to understand it, and Donald picked the spoon back up. That's a certain kind of damage. Not the obvious kind. The kind that works its way into the foundation slowly, where you can't see it until something shifts. So you don't regret it. I regret that it was frightening, and I don't regret what I did. Brian looked at him for a moment, processing the way he processed things quietly, thoroughly, without rushing toward a conclusion he hadn't fully reached yet. "Someone from the U.S. Attorney's Office called me," Donald said, and 2 weeks ago, referred by Harris, said the trial is moving forward and the evidence is holding up. Brian's expression shifted. "They called you directly, said I should know how it was going since I was part of starting it, and are you going to have to testify?" "Possibly. About what I observed, what I saw on the screen, what I did afterward. Not about the forensics. I didn't do the forensics. Just about what I saw and what I decided." He stirred the pot again. "If I have to, and I will." Brian was quiet for a moment. Then, what if his lawyers try to make you look bad? Like you were doing something wrong by being in there? Donald thought about the defense attorney's opening statement, and the careful emphasis on unauthorized observer. They might try, that's their job, that's not fair, no. But it's how it works. He turned the heat down under the pot. "I can't control how other people frame what I did, and I can only know what I actually did and why I did it." Brian looked back at his textbook, traced a diagram with his pencil, an open system with arrows showing energy moving in and out. Nothing held permanently, everything in transit, and "I told my friend Kevin about it," Brian said. "Not the details, just that my dad saw something wrong at work and reported it even though it was risky." Donald waited. He said his dad would never do that. "Too much to lose," Brian paused, and I said my dad had already lost a lot of things and decided that some things were worth more than the risk of losing more. The kitchen was very quiet. Donald looked at his son. 15 years old now. Still growing another half-inch since Christmas, and maybe more. Still the same person who had handed him a coffee mug with a cracked handle and called it a gift, and meant every bit of it without any performance. He was raising someone. That had always been true, but it arrived differently in moments like this. The understanding that everything he did was also instruction. That the 2 minutes and 11 seconds he had spent in front of a monitor at 2:14 in the morning had been, among other things, a lesson, and one that his son had taken and translated into his own language and passed on to a friend at school on an ordinary afternoon, and that friend had taken it somewhere too, in whatever form it arrived in him. He didn't say any of that, and it was too large for the kitchen on a Friday evening with rice on the stove. He just said, "Set the table," and Brian closed his textbook and did, and the all-hands meeting happened on a Wednesday morning in May, not the auditorium. Lorraine had thought about the auditorium and decided against it. The scale felt wrong. Too ceremonial for what she wanted to say, and too much like a production designed to make people feel something, rather than actually saying something worth feeling. She used the main collaborative space on the 3rd floor instead, and the big open area with the exposed ceiling and the high windows that let in the late morning light at a low angle, the kind of light that made everything look considered. No raised platform, no microphone, no slide deck queued up behind her, and just the space. And CoreShield's 412 employees arranged in whatever configuration felt natural, sitting on the modular furniture, or standing along the windows or perched on desk edges with coffee cups in hand, and the informal posture of people who had been through enough in the past several months that ceremony felt beside the point. She stood in the middle of it. She had not prepared remarks. She had prepared to be honest, and, which was a different thing and harder to do, she told them about the night. Not in the abbreviated language of corporate communication, in the actual sequence of what had happened, the access log she had left visible on her monitor, and the decision to stay rather than go home, the sound of a cleaning cart in the hallway at 2:14 in the morning and the change in the room's air when the door opened. She told them about 2 minutes and 11 seconds, and she told them about a man who had stood in front of a screen he had no authorization to be reading, in a building full of people who had been paid far more to notice exactly what was on that screen and had recognized in seconds what those credentialed and compensated people had missed for 3 months. Not because he was more intelligent than everyone else, because he had a specific kind of knowledge and he had not pretended not to have it when it became relevant. She did not say Donald's name, and he was standing in the space like everyone else, near the east windows, where the late morning light came in strongest, in the gray suit that still sat slightly differently on him than it would in another year. She had not pre-arranged his position, and he was simply there, the way employees were there, listening without performing. She said, "I spent 22 years building this company on the belief that the people who mattered most were the ones with the most authority, the ones on the org chart, and the ones in the rooms where the decisions got made." She paused. "I was wrong about that, not entirely, but wrong in the way that matters most. I was wrong about where integrity actually lives." The room was quiet, and not the managed silence of corporate events where people waited politely for the next scheduled element. The kind that came when something reached somewhere people hadn't expected to be reached. "Integrity doesn't live in the org chart," she said, "and it lives in the people who exercise it when nobody's watching, when no protocol requires it. When the rational calculation says look away and keep moving." Another pause. The person who saved this company was not in the boardroom that morning, and he was not on the executive team. He was not on any organizational chart I had ever prioritized or even thought about. He was the man who cleaned my office at 2 in the morning, and he saw what the rest of us were either missing or ignoring, and she looked across the space, at engineers and analysts and support staff and the security desk team, and the people from the maintenance crew who had come in their work clothes because the meeting was during the day shift and they hadn't gone home yet, and I set a trap that night to test whether integrity still existed somewhere inside these walls, she said. But the truth is, he was the one who tested me. He showed me what integrity actually looked like in practice, and it doesn't look like a title, and it doesn't look like a corner office or a stock option or a name on a building. It looks like a person standing alone in the dark, deciding that they cannot unknow what they know. She let that sit in the room then, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you the company is saved. We're better than we were 6 months ago. We are not yet where we need to be. There is real work ahead and some of it will be hard, and I cannot promise you the outcome. And she looked at the faces in the room, all of them, the ones she recognized and the ones she was still learning. What I can tell you is that I understand something now that I did not understand a year ago, and every person in this building is part of what this company is, not as a phrase in a mission statement, but as a fact. The infrastructure that matters most is not in our servers, and it's in the people who show up every day and make the right call even when it costs them something. She stopped there, not because she had run out of words, because it was enough. The right version of the thing was already in the room, and adding more would only dilute it. 3 weeks after the all-hands, Stephanie Harris called to say that Victor Bryant had reached a plea agreement, 11 counts, 11 years federal, with parole eligibility beginning at the 7-year mark, and the remaining 3 counts dropped as part of the negotiation. Scott Hill had pled separately and received 4 years in exchange for full cooperation and complete documentation of the financial arrangement, and Vantage Systems had entered bankruptcy proceedings, the actual signed kind, the kind Lorraine had been standing at the edge of 8 months earlier, pen to paper, yellow tab in place. The federal defense contract went back to recompetition, and CoreShield's legal team filed to be considered. Lorraine did not assume they would win it back. The agency had its own process and its own timeline and its own evaluation criteria, that had nothing to do with what Core Shield had been through, and she submitted the application and directed her energy elsewhere, toward the 2 enterprise clients who had returned, toward the 3 new clients who had signed on in the previous quarter, toward the 32nd floor, where Donald Thomas was building a monitoring framework that had already caught 2 anomalies in its first month of operation, both minor, both resolved before they became anything, both exactly the kind of early detection the original system had been too incomplete to provide. He was good at this. She had been certain he would be, but certainty and evidence were different things, and watching him actually do it was different from knowing he could. He had a way of reading systems from the inside, understanding not just what a structure was designed to do but where it was most likely to fail and in what sequence, and he caught things before they looked like anything to anyone else. He asked questions about decisions she had made years ago and needed to understand the reasoning behind before he could determine whether the reasoning still held. Some of it did, and some of it didn't. He told her when it didn't. That had been the condition she offered, and he held her to it without drama and without apology, the way you held someone to a thing they had asked for. She appreciated this more than she had words for, and she had built Core Shield by trusting her own judgment, and her judgment had been right enough often enough that she had stopped interrogating it as thoroughly as she should, and having someone in the room who was not managing her approval, who was simply trying to find the gap before someone else found it. First was a correction she had needed for years without knowing it, and the defense contract decision arrived on a Friday afternoon in September, an email from the contracting agency. Formal language, official notification of award Core Shield. She read it twice. Then she called Donald's extension. He picked up immediately, and yeah, the defense contract. A pause. Which direction? Ours. The silence on the line lasted about 4 seconds. She heard him exhale, not the exhale of someone who had been holding their breath dramatically, but the exhale of someone who had been holding it practically, for months, without making it visible, and was now letting it go because the situation finally allowed. Good, he said. Just that one word. She almost laughed. Almost, and I thought you should be the first to know. Why? She thought about the yellow tab on page 52. About 2 minutes and 11 seconds, and about a man who had stood in her dark office in the middle of the night and made a choice that set in motion everything that had eventually led to this phone call on a Friday afternoon in September. Because you were the first to do something about it, she said. 8 months ago. When doing something about it was considerably harder than this. He was quiet for a moment. I have the anomaly report ready for your 4 o'clock review, he said. She smiled. Fully, this time. I'll be there, September turned into October. October into November. The company did not transform overnight. It grew slowly, the way things grew after being cut back hard. First the roots, invisible, strengthening in the ground, then the early evidence above the surface. A new contract, a renewed partnership, a quarter that closed better than the previous one, the accumulation of evidence that the organization had not just survived what happened to it, but was learning from it in ways that went deeper than the obvious lessons. Donald's division produced its first comprehensive internal report in November, 48 pages. Every access anomaly detected, every threshold adjusted, every gap in the original monitoring architecture identified and addressed. He had included at the end, a section he titled Structural Risk Assessment, his systematic analysis of every legacy decision in Core Shield's infrastructure that carried ongoing vulnerability. 6 items, ranked by severity, with specific recommendations for each, the second item on the list was the 2021 proposal, the one she had partially funded. He had noted, without editorial commentary, which elements had been implemented, which had not, and what each unimplemented element represented in terms of ongoing exposure. She read that section 3 times. Then she approved the full implementation of the remaining elements, including the anomaly detection threshold feature that the original proposal had specified, and she had declined 3 years ago for budget reasons. The feature that would have caught Victor in week 2. It was too late to matter in that particular way, Victor was in the custody of the federal system. The breach was closed and the damage had been documented and the legal proceedings were on their own timeline now. But that wasn't the reason to do it now, the reason to do it now was that the past had shown her something she needed to carry forward. Gaps did not stay harmless. The right time to close them was always before someone found them. Always before. Not after the finding, not after the damage, and not after you had spent 8 months in a legal parenthesis wondering if you still had a company. Before, on a Thursday morning in December, Lorraine arrived at her office at 7 and found a note on her desk. Not an email. A physical note, handwritten on plain white paper in the deliberate penmanship of someone who had not handwritten a note in some time and was making the effort anyway. She read it standing up, still in her coat. Lorraine, I wanted to tell you something before the year ends. When I took the photographs that night, I wasn't thinking about your company. I wasn't thinking about the investigation or what would happen after or any of it, I was thinking about the fact that I had stopped being the person who understood those systems. I had told myself that person was gone, lost with everything else I lost when things fell apart, seeing that screen reminded me of something I had spent 3 years trying to forget. You can set knowledge down. You can walk away from it and tell yourself it belongs to a version of you that no longer exists. But it waits, it stays exactly where you left it. This year I picked it back up. I don't know what I'm worth to this company in terms that show up on a balance sheet, but I know what this year has been worth to me. I came back upstairs because you asked me to, I stayed because I remembered who I was. Thank you for giving me the room to do that. She read it twice, set it on the desk, looked at the window. Outside, the first snow of December had come sometime in the night and left the city quiet in a way Chicago rarely allowed itself to be. The streets below muffled, the usual noise absorbed into white, the whole thing temporary and specific to this one morning, before the traffic started and the ordinary volume of the city reasserted itself. She had built this company from a basement. 22 years, she had made 1,000 good decisions and a handful of decisions with gaps in them that she would carry as permanent instruction for as long as she ran this organization, she had been betrayed by someone she had trusted and had learned from the shape of that betrayal. Something she could not have learned any other way, that trust built on longevity alone was not the same as trust built on accountability, and that the difference between them was not visible until it was too late to matter. And in the middle of all of it, at 2 in the morning on a night when she had arranged things to look like nothing was happening, a man had walked through her door with a cleaning cart and reminded her what integrity looked like when it had no audience, not the version in mission statements or annual reports or the speeches she had given over 22 years at podiums and town halls and client dinners. The other version, the one that existed in the moment when a person had everything to lose and nothing to gain, and still could not make themselves walk away from what was right. She folded the note carefully, put it in the drawer of her desk where she kept the things she needed to keep the things that were true and worth returning to. Then she took off her coat, sat down, opened her laptop, the anomaly report from the 32nd floor was waiting in her inbox. Time-stamped 6:48 a.m. He had been there before her. She opened it and got to work.